Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. I'm a structural engineer by trade, which means I know a thing or two about what keeps a house standing. I've been living in my neighborhood for about 5 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything when it comes to HOA drama. I was wrong. 3 years ago, I had a beautiful slate roof installed on my house. Not cheap, but it was under full warranty and looked absolutely stunning. The kind of roof that makes your neighbors secretly jealous but also adds real value to the property. I'd done my research, hired a reputable contractor, and even got approval from the Architectural Review Committee before the installation. Everything was done by the book. The neighborhood has an HOA, like most places these days. The board president is this woman I'll call the board president who treats our little community like it's her personal kingdom. She's the type who measures grass height with a ruler and sends violation notices if your mailbox is 2 shades off from the approved color palette. Most of us just try to stay under her radar. About a year ago, I got wind that the board was discussing some kind of aesthetic uniformity initiative. I sent them an email reminding them that my roof was relatively new, under warranty, and had been approved by their own architectural committee. I wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any issues down the road. The board president responded that they were just exploring options and that established roofs wouldn't be affected. I saved that email. Fast forward to last month. I had to fly out of state for a 48-hour consulting job. Nothing major, just helping another firm with a structural assessment. I left on a Tuesday morning, planning to be back Thursday evening. Wednesday night, I got a text from my neighbor asking if I was having work done on my house. I told him no, and he said there was a dumpster in my driveway and workers had been there all day. I figured it had to be a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong address. I called the number on the dumpster company, but it was after hours. Thursday morning, I got another text with a photo that made my blood run cold. Half my roof was gone, not damaged, not being repaired, gone. Stripped down to the decking with tools and materials scattered everywhere. I immediately called my airline to change my flight and managed to get home by early afternoon. What I found was worse than the photos. About 70% of my slate roof had been torn off and thrown into a dumpster. There were workers on my property, and the foreman was directing guys to strip the rest. I walked up to the foreman and very calmly asked what was going on. He said they had a work order to replace the roof on this address because it was structurally unsound and the property was abandoned. I asked to see the work order. That's when things got interesting. The work order was signed by the HOA board, not by me, not by any homeowner. The contractor was something called Budget Best Roofing, and the paperwork claimed the roof was an emergency hazard that needed immediate replacement. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I told the foreman that this was my house, I was not abandoning it, and my roof had been perfectly fine when I left 2 days ago. I instructed them to stop all work immediately and leave everything exactly as it was. The foreman looked confused and a little worried. He said his boss had told him the HOA had full authority to authorize emergency repairs on abandoned properties. I explained that the property wasn't abandoned and showed him my driver's license with the address. He called his boss. While he was on the phone, I took photos and video of everything. The stripped roof, the dumpster full of my slate tiles, the work order, the truck with the company name. I also noticed something interesting. The license plate on the main work truck was registered to an LLC I didn't recognize, but the smaller truck had a magnetic sign that was slightly crooked. When I looked closer, I could see another company name underneath. The foreman hung up and told me his boss wanted to talk to the HOA president before stopping work. I told him that was fine, but if anyone touched another shingle on my house, I'd consider it criminal trespass. The crew packed up their tools but left everything else, including the half-finished roof exposed to the elements with just a few tarps thrown over it. I immediately called the board president. She answered on the third ring with this fake sweet voice asking how my trip went. I told her about coming home to find my roof demolished and asked what the hell was going on. Her tone changed completely. She explained that the board had passed something called a uniformity amendment while I was away. Apparently my slate roof didn't match the new aesthetic standards they'd decided on. She said they'd done me a favor by starting the work while I was gone to avoid the stress and inconvenience of construction noise. When I pointed out that I owned my house and they had no legal authority to tear off my roof, she got defensive. She claimed that all homeowners had signed agreements giving the HOA authority to maintain community standards. She also informed me that the cost of the new roof, about $22,000, would be added to my HOA dues as a special assessment. I asked if she was completely insane. She told me not to use that tone with her and said I could take it up with the board at the next monthly meeting. Then she hung up. I spent the rest of Thursday afternoon making phone calls. First, I called my insurance company to report the damage and started a claim. The claims adjuster couldn't believe what I was describing and said they'd never heard of an HOA authorizing roof removal without homeowner consent. They scheduled an emergency inspection for the next morning and advised me to get temporary weatherproofing immediately. Next, I called my lawyer, a guy I'd worked with on some construction disputes before. When I explained what had happened, there was a long pause before he started asking detailed questions about the HOA bylaws, the work authorization, and whether I'd received any prior notice. He told me to document everything, save all communications, and said he'd review the HOA governing documents that night. He also mentioned that what I was describing sounded like it could involve both civil and potentially criminal liability. I also called a couple of trusted contractors I knew from my engineering work to get emergency tarping done properly. Most were booked, but one agreed to come out that evening to at least make my house weatherproof until we could figure out the legal mess. The contractor who came out was shocked at the work quality. He pointed out that whoever had torn off my roof had damaged several pieces of underlying decking that had been perfectly fine. They'd also failed to properly secure the building paper, which meant any moisture would cause immediate damage to the structural elements underneath. He said it looked like the work had been done by people who either didn't know what they were doing or didn't care about protecting the structure. He spent 3 hours properly tarping and securing my roof, and refused to charge me anything. He said no homeowner should have to deal with something like this, and he wanted to help however he could. I got his contact information and made sure to get photos of his proper weatherproofing work for comparison to what Budget Best had left behind. That night, it rained. The storm that hit was nothing special for our area, just a typical autumn thunderstorm with moderate rainfall, but it exposed exactly how inadequate the Budget Best tarping job had been. The tarps the contractors had thrown over my exposed roof were apparently just for show. Water got through in multiple places, damaging my ceiling in 3 rooms and ruining some electronics. I took photos of everything, including the water streaming through my light fixtures. Friday morning, I did some research on Budget Best Roofing. The company was registered as an LLC about 8 months ago. The registered agent was someone with the same last name as the board president. After some digging through public records, I confirmed that Budget Best Roofing was owned by her brother-in-law. The deeper I dug, the more interesting it got. Budget Best Roofing had been the contractor for 3 other projects in our neighborhood over the past year, all of which had been approved by the board without competitive bidding. The total value of those contracts was over $60,000, and in each case, the work had been described as emergency maintenance that couldn't wait for the normal approval process. I also discovered that the company had been cited by the state contractors board twice in the past 6 months for performing work without proper permits and for starting projects without signed contracts from property owners. The second citation was still under appeal. When I looked at the Better Business Bureau records, Budget Best had an F rating with multiple complaints about poor workmanship, failure to complete projects, and disputes over billing. Several customers had reported that the company would start work based on verbal agreements and then demand payment for additional services that hadn't been discussed. That's when I realized this wasn't just a mistake or some overzealous HOA power trip. This was a systematic scheme where the board president was funneling HOA money to her brother-in-law's struggling construction business under the guise of emergency maintenance. I started pulling HOA financial records, which as a homeowner I had the right to review. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. Over the past 18 months, the HOA had paid Budget Best Roofing over $80,000 for various projects, none of which had gone through competitive bidding. The work orders were all signed by the board president personally, and the invoices were always approved for payment at the next board meeting without discussion. Several of these projects had been described as emergency repairs, but when I drove around the neighborhood looking at the properties involved, I couldn't see evidence of emergency conditions. In fact, one of the houses where Budget Best had supposedly repaired storm damage didn't show any signs of ever having roof problems. Instead of immediately filing a lawsuit, I decided to be methodical about this. I'm an engineer, after all, and I know that the best way to win a complex dispute is to have overwhelming documentation and a clear understanding of all the relevant laws and regulations. I hired a forensic adjuster to inspect my roof before the contractors came back. The adjuster confirmed that my original roof had been in excellent condition with no structural issues, no leaks, and several years left on the warranty. He provided a detailed report stating that there had been no emergency justification for the removal. I also sent a formal notice of trespass and property destruction to both the HOA and Budget Best Roofing via certified mail. The letter outlined exactly what had happened, demanded immediate cessation of all work, and required them to make my property weatherproof pending resolution. The following week, I got a late notice from the HOA saying I owed $22,000 for my special roof assessment, plus a $50 late fee since it was now past due. They'd apparently backdated the assessment to the day before they tore off my roof. I spent that weekend researching state law and our HOA bylaws. I found something interesting buried in the state property code. Any capital improvement over $15,000 to an individual property requires approval by at least 75% of the community membership. Basic maintenance and emergency repairs don't count, but replacing a functional roof definitely qualifies as a capital improvement. The HOA had never held a vote. They'd never even announced the uniformity amendment to the general membership. I also discovered that board members can be held personally liable for breach of fiduciary duty if they approve expenditures that benefit their own families or business interests without proper disclosure and community approval. This gave me an idea. I organized what I called a roofing information session and invited every homeowner in the neighborhood. I sent out a simple flyer explaining that I wanted to share some important information about upcoming HOA assessments and their legal implications. I made sure to frame it as educational rather than confrontational, which I knew would get better attendance. About 40 homeowners showed up in my backyard the following Saturday afternoon. I'd prepared a presentation with photos, documents, and a timeline of events. I started by explaining my background as a structural engineer so people would understand I knew what I was talking about when it came to construction issues. I laid out the whole story chronologically, showed them the forensic report, the photos of my destroyed roof, and the documentation proving Budget Best Roofing was owned by the board president's brother-in-law. I also presented the financial analysis I'd done of all the HOA payments to Budget Best over the past 18 months. The crowd got increasingly angry as the presentation went on. Several people interrupted to ask questions, and a few mentioned that they'd noticed work being done around the neighborhood that seemed unnecessary or overpriced. One homeowner said Budget Best had knocked on his door 6 months ago claiming the HOA had authorized them to inspect his roof for storm damage, but when he called the management company, they said no such authorization had been given. Then I explained the financial implications, and this is where things got really interesting. If the HOA paid out $22,000 to Budget Best Roofing without proper authorization and I sued for damages, the legal costs could easily exceed $100,000. But the real problem was that if the pattern of unauthorized payments continued, every homeowner in the neighborhood could be liable for special assessments to cover the legal costs and fraudulent expenditures. I also explained that under state law, homeowners could be held personally responsible for HOA debts if the association became insolvent due to mismanagement or fraudulent activities by the board. This meant that everyone's property values and personal finances were at risk if we didn't address the situation immediately. One homeowner asked what would happen if other people's roofs were targeted next. I explained that the uniformity amendment the board had supposedly passed was never properly voted on by the community, which meant it had no legal validity. But that wouldn't stop them from trying to use it to justify more unauthorized work. Another person wanted to know why the management company hadn't caught this. I'd researched that too. The management company we used was actually just a bookkeeping service that processed invoices submitted by the board. They weren't required to verify that the board had proper authorization for expenditures under $10,000. Since Budget Best had been careful to split their work into smaller invoices, most of the payments had flown under the radar. The reaction was immediate and loud. Nobody had been told about the uniformity amendment. Several people asked if their own roofs might be targeted next. A few homeowners mentioned they'd gotten quotes for roof replacement in the past, and Budget Best had been the most expensive option they'd received, sometimes by as much as 40%. By the end of the meeting, I had signatures from 43 homeowners requesting an emergency board meeting to address the situation. More importantly, I had several people volunteer to help research the HOA's financial records and identify other questionable expenditures. Over the next few days, the volunteer group found even more problems. The HOA had paid Budget Best for tree trimming services that were supposed to be covered under our landscaping contract with a different company. They'd authorized emergency sprinkler repairs that the irrigation company said were unnecessary. They'd even paid for sidewalk crack sealing that had already been done by the city as part of a street improvement project. The total amount of questionable payments was approaching $150,000, which represented about 2 years' worth of regular HOA dues for the entire neighborhood. On Monday, I filed a lawsuit. Not just against the HOA, but against each board member individually for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion. Since they'd personally benefited from authorizing payments to a family member's business without disclosure, their directors' and officers' insurance probably wouldn't cover them. I also sent a copy of all my documentation to the state licensing board, since Budget Best Roofing had performed work without the property owner's authorization and had falsely claimed emergency conditions to justify their actions. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. The board president tried to control the narrative by sending out a letter to all homeowners claiming I was a disgruntled resident trying to avoid paying for necessary repairs. The letter also claimed that my roof had been deteriorating for months and that neighbors had complained about falling slate tiles, which was completely false. The letter backfired. Several homeowners who received it called me to express their anger at what they saw as obvious lies. A few mentioned that they'd been keeping an eye on my house while I was away on business trips and had never seen any problems with my roof. The letter also contained some factual errors about HOA authority that made it clear the board president didn't actually understand the legal limitations of her position. It didn't work. The meeting was packed and people were angry. The community center meeting room normally held about 30 people, but we had over 60 show up. People were standing along the walls and sitting on the floor. The board looked visibly uncomfortable as residents filed in carrying folders of documents and printouts. Several homeowners had done their own research after my information session and found more questionable expenditures that seemed to benefit board members' relatives or businesses. The secretary's son-in-law had been paid to power wash the community mailboxes for $800 when the regular maintenance crew had quoted $200 for the same job. The treasurer had authorized payment to her nephew's landscaping company for emergency tree removal that turned out to be routine pruning covered under the existing contract. When the board president called the meeting to order, she tried to start with routine business like approving the previous meeting minutes. The crowd wasn't having it. Someone immediately called for a motion to address the roof situation first, and it was seconded by about 10 people at once. She tried to maintain control by saying they'd address my complaint during the homeowner forum portion of the meeting, which was typically limited to 3 minutes per person. That's when things got really heated. One of my neighbors, a retired lawyer, stood up and explained that this wasn't a complaint. It was a potential criminal matter that required immediate board action. He pointed out that the board had a fiduciary responsibility to address allegations of financial mismanagement and that trying to limit discussion could be seen as evidence of bad faith. The board president tried to argue that the meeting had to follow proper procedures, but someone called for a motion to suspend normal procedures and allow unlimited time for discussion of the roof issue. The motion was seconded immediately and passed unanimously among the homeowners present. I stood up and presented my settlement offer, but first I laid out all the evidence my volunteer research team had gathered. The total amount of questionable payments to Budget Best and other connected companies was now documented at over $170,000. I had copies of the state licensing board citations, the Better Business Bureau complaints, and a detailed analysis showing that the HOA had overpaid for routine services by an average of 60% when using board members' family businesses. The settlement offer was straightforward. The HOA would pay for complete restoration of my roof by a contractor of my choice, cover all interior damage from the water intrusion, pay my legal fees, and accept the board president's immediate resignation. The board would also authorize a comprehensive forensic audit of all HOA finances going back 3 years, conducted by an independent accounting firm. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit against the individual board members and wouldn't pursue criminal charges for the kickback scheme, provided that all questionable payments were recovered and the board implemented new financial controls to prevent future abuse. If they refused, I would proceed with the lawsuit, turn over my evidence to the district attorney for investigation of potential criminal fraud, and file complaints against Budget Best Roofing's license with the state contractors board. I'd also file a complaint with the state attorney general's office regarding HOA mismanagement and potential violations of nonprofit corporation laws. The board president tried to argue that the HOA had acted within its authority and that I was being unreasonable. She claimed the roof replacement was necessary for community standards and that $22,000 was a fair price for the work. She also suggested that the other payments I'd identified were legitimate business expenses and that questioning them was harassment of board members. This was a mistake. Several homeowners had brought their own copies of the HOA bylaws and governing documents, and they started reading aloud the specific sections that limited board authority and required competitive bidding for services over certain dollar amounts. The board president clearly hadn't expected this level of preparation from the community. She also made the mistake of claiming that homeowners didn't have the right to question board decisions as long as proper procedures were followed. The retired lawyer I mentioned earlier stood up and explained that this was completely wrong under state law and that homeowners had extensive rights to review financial records and challenge board actions that exceeded their authority. That's when I delivered what I thought was a pretty good line. I told her she had the right to maintain the bushes, but she didn't have the right to dismantle my house. Several homeowners started applauding and the mood in the room shifted completely. Someone called for a vote of no confidence in the current board. Another person suggested that if the board didn't accept my settlement offer, they should all be replaced immediately, and the new board should authorize criminal referrals for the financial mismanagement. A few people started shouting questions about their own property assessments and whether other unauthorized work had been done. The meeting was getting chaotic, and the board president was clearly losing control. The board asked for a 15-minute recess to discuss the matter privately. During the break, homeowners were organizing into small groups, sharing contact information, and discussing strategies for recalling board members if the settlement was rejected. I overheard several conversations about hiring their own lawyers and pursuing separate actions against the board members personally. When they came back, the board president announced that the board would accept my settlement terms. She submitted her resignation effective immediately, and the remaining board members voted to authorize payment for my roof restoration and legal fees. They also agreed to conduct a comprehensive audit of all HOA expenditures from the past 2 years. I ended up with a $35,000 designer roof installed by a contractor I'd worked with before. The HOA's insurance covered most of the cost, though they had to use a significant portion of the reserve fund for my legal fees and the interior repairs. The forensic adjuster's report also helped several other homeowners who discovered that previous work authorized by the old board had been unnecessary and overpriced. The state licensing board suspended Budget Best Roofing's license pending investigation, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that the former board president and her family moved out of state a few months later. The new board is much more careful about following proper procedures and getting community input before making major decisions. They also implemented new policies requiring disclosure of any business relationships between board members and potential contractors. I'm sitting on my back porch right now, looking up at my beautiful new slate roof that cost me exactly $0. The workmanship is incredible, and the warranty is even better than my original roof. Sometimes playing things smart and methodical pays off better than just getting angry and emotional. The best part happened just last week. I was working in my yard when a process server pulled up and handed some papers to the guy working on the lawn across the street. Turns out it was someone from the state attorney general's office serving Budget Best Roofing with a cease and desist order related to unlicensed contracting practices. I may have waved at the process server, just being neighborly, of course. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't about getting even. It's about being smarter than the people trying to take advantage of you and making sure they can't do it to anyone else. The old board president thought she could intimidate people with legal-sounding letters and bureaucratic procedures, but she forgot that some of us actually understand how the system works. My roof looks fantastic, my house is worth more than it was before, and the neighborhood is a much better place to live. Plus, I've got enough documented evidence of the whole affair to write a case study that I'm thinking about submitting to a legal journal about HOA governance and fiduciary responsibility. Sometimes being a structural engineer comes in handy for more than just analyzing building foundations. Understanding how systems work, whether they're made of steel and concrete or bylaws and legal procedures, gives you a huge advantage when someone tries to bulldoze over your rights. The former board president learned that lesson the hard way. I just wish I could have seen her face when she got served with that licensing board complaint. But the most satisfying part isn't the new roof or the money I saved. It's knowing that 43 other homeowners now understand their rights and won't be pushed around by the next power-hungry board member who thinks they can spend other people's money without consequences. That's worth more than any roof replacement, no matter how expensive. I still get questions from neighbors about HOA law and property rights. I always tell them the same thing: read your documents, know your rights, and document everything. Most bullies back down when they realize you're not going to be an easy target. And if you ever get a work order for roof replacement that you didn't authorize, start recording video immediately. You're probably going to need it later. The next one is a malicious compliance story. A couple of years ago, I was in the Navy and assigned duties on board a ship. At the start of the story, I was an extremely junior service member, lowest rank in my shop. Typically, on board the ship, our usual uniform was coveralls in our department, and we arrived and left from the ship when in home port in civilian clothes. Now, we were moving up the river, about 4 hours underway, about an hour driving distance, for a week to unload weapons stores for a training exercise underway coming up later that month. Typically, when leaving the area of the port of record, which we would for the training exercise, We're also required to have suitable transit uniforms aboard in case we pull into port elsewhere. For this week-long weapons onload, I had no plans to leave the ship, and we weren't leaving our port of record's geographical area, and would be returning to our home berth again before the upcoming trip, so I didn't prep my uniforms to bring on board, seeing no use for them. At the last minute, our medical department scheduled medical appointments on our behalf at a small satellite clinic at the weapons station, with no input of our own, and informed me I'd have a dental appointment while there. I immediately went to my supervisor with the issue, because I had no suitable uniforms for off-ship use on board, and we were required to attend medical appointments in uniform. I get written up for not having my uniforms. Now, there is no specific policies on which types or how many uniforms are required to be on board, but there are asterisk specific policies on having sea bag inspections and what is required to be present for them, so my write-up was for not having an inspection-ready sea bag available. Copy that, makes sense. When we get home that weekend, I move all my military uniforms aboard, bringing a full inspection-ready sea bag to the ship as required, and leaving no uniforms at home. Everything's peachy. Fast forward a few years, and I have commanding officer's approval to miss an upcoming late-minute rescheduled underway due to prior scheduled leave in order to re-enlist. While I'm halfway across the country re-enlisting, my department fails an important inspection for our deployment workups. The inspectors work with the ship's command to reschedule, and they adjust the underway schedule last minute again. Now they're getting underway for a re-inspect the night before my leave ends, and the re-inspection starts the day I return from leave. The inspectors will be ferried to the ship the morning of by water taxi. They ask me to curtail my leave a day early, buy new tickets, and show up to help with this re-inspect. I inform them that I would prefer not to dole out thousands of dollars of my own money for last-minute changes to travel arrangements because of their failure, but understand if ordered I can financially do so. Since my leave was approved by the CO to miss an underway, I'd like verbiage from the CO that my leave has been rescinded, recalling me, and if I receive such, it'll make me question my dedication to re-enlisting in a Navy that doesn't care about my financial well-being, meaning I'll leave the 6 months earlier than they expected when I get out of the Navy instead of re-enlist, and won't return with signed re-enlistment papers. They balked, of course, and had me report the day my leave was originally planned to end. They decided I'd catch a ride with the water taxi and all the senior officer inspectors for the hour trip to meet the ship. Sounded interesting. The stinger? I asked them what I should wear for the water taxi ride, as all my uniforms were on the ship. They freaked out and asked why all my uniforms were on the ship, naturally. I explained I was ordered to do so by my supervisor and received a counseling chit for not having left all my uniforms on the ship previously. My options? Some recently cleaned coveralls. I'd take them home for laundry, ensuring I kept 2 pairs on the ship as required for sea bag rules from before my leave, or my civilian clothes. Why? Because that's what I was told to do the last time a shipboard uniform use issue came up. So yeah, there I was, a junior E5, in civilian clothes, on board a chartered water taxi with a bunch of 04/05/06S in their uniforms at 5 in the morning, on the way to redo a previously failed inspection. The next one is an entitled People Story. I feel like I need to start this by saying I don't hate dogs. I really do believe that there are no bad dogs, only bad owners. But I don't like it when strange dogs jump on me, shed, or slobber all over me. I really hate it when loose dogs run at me or chase me. Just because you like the dog doesn't mean everyone will turn to mush over it or even wants to interact with it. I live in a neighborhood where the fences were built at the same time as the houses, and they are not terribly secure. There are things you can do about it, but it seems that not enough of the residents have bothered because loose dogs are a common occurrence. Of course, there are a large number repeat offenders, and those people never take accountability. They just blame the poor fence construction and shrug it off and dogs being dogs. Recently, one of the repeat offenders sent letters to everyone in the neighborhood explaining proper loose dog etiquette. She also posted it to several of the neighborhood forums. It was ridiculous, but the gist of it is her darling fur babies or geriatric giant puppies got out, and she didn't care for how the dogs were treated by the people who found them. So she was determined to educate everyone on how it should have gone, at least according to her. She of course explained that her dogs never get out, and this was a first, despite multiple posts going back at least a year featuring those same dogs on Loose Dogs Spotted on X Street posts. She went on for half a page about how the fences are the real issue. My next-door neighbors have never had an issue with their 2 dogs because they secured the fence. And that dogs getting out is just something that happens even under the best circumstances, so we all need to be aware of the proper way to handle it. And then she went on to explain the do's and don'ts of how to handle it. Do call the dogs to you so you can bring it into your house, or at least your yard, in order to make sure the dog is safe and secure. Don't ignore it and let it continue to wander. It's probably lonely and scared. I mean, the poor puppy is lost after all. Do make sure it's warm, dry, and comfortable. Don't, under any circumstances, feed it. You don't know if it's on a special diet, you might make it sick, so just don't feed it at all. Do take a picture, or a lot from many different angles just in case, and post it to all the social media platforms. That way the poor baby's worried mama can find it. Don't, whatever you do, bring it to a shelter. It doesn't matter if it's been a few hours or a few days and no one has come looking for it. The owner might be busy or not realize the dog is missing. The shelters are terrible, cruel places, and the dogs will be lonely and scared. Plus, when the dog mommy finally realizes her precious baby is missing, she might not be able to afford the fine, or if it's over the weekend, she might have to wait till Monday to get it out. The shelter, even if it's no kill, is the wrong thing to do, always and forever. And of course, if you have done all of the above and find that you just do not have the ability to continue to care for what is now a very hungry and confused animal, then you should go back to social media and beg one of the many strangers on the internet to take the dog and care for it until its mommy or daddy can finally be bothered to get it. I was dying. I thought it was a prank. But seriously, the Facebook post, between the original post and all the comments, was the best of all. Apparently, when the woman's dogs got out, which, regardless of what she said, seems to happen regularly, someone did catch them and made a good faith effort to find the owner. They posted on 2 neighborhood forums and kept the dogs overnight and fed them in the morning with their own dogs. The next afternoon, when the dogs were still unclaimed, they took the dogs to a local no-kill shelter. It was late Friday afternoon by then, and that particular shelter does not have public hours after 4:30 or at all on weekends. These dogs had no collars, tags, or microchips. Saturday morning, the owner finally saw the social media post and was livid to discover that her fur babies, that she claims to be unable to be parted from for even an hour, but had by then been missing for 2 days, and no, the owner was not out of town, had been fed strange food by complete strangers and then dumped at a shelter. Worse still, she was unable to retrieve her sweet babies until Monday. She was also furious about the expensive fine. I looked it up. The first offense is like $10. It's repeat offenses that get pricey. The letter and the Facebook posts were not even subtly calling these people out as dog-hating, irresponsible jerks who tried to break up her family. Sorry, maybe dogs getting out is a thing that just happens. I personally think that's a BS excuse. But if your dog gets out and I happen to encounter it, if it appears aggressive, there is a pretty good chance it's getting a face full of pepper spray and then animal control is getting a phone call. If it's not aggressive, I'll either ignore it, or if it keeps hanging around and no one has come looking for it, yeah, that doggy is going to the shelter. I may or may not bother to post it to social media. I'm even less likely after this. Maybe instead of calling out the kind people who took your loose dogs in when you couldn't be bothered to look for them, you should just be happy they put in the effort they did. Anyway, thank you for watching.